in certain contexts, agency is actually used synonymously for a person with free will. However, there are some nuances where sometimes they'll make a discrimination between an agent and a free agent, where an agent is, you could even call a spider an agent insofar as its movements are not random, there's some kind of locus of control there, and when it's acting, it's behaving in a way that's purposeful in some way. On the other hand, though, we don't think that a spider has free will insofar as we don't think that it's looking at different alternatives and making choices according to reasons. Nevertheless, in the contemporary literature, agency, for our purposes, we can just call it when we're talking about free will. And it's a perennial problem in philosophy. In other words, it goes all the way back to the very beginnings. And each generation finds its own iteration of the problem. In the medieval period in particular, there was the presupposition that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. And if that's correct, if God is omniscient, if he's all-knowing, then God knows everything that's going to happen. And if God knows everything that's going to happen, God knows everything that's going to happen in your life. And if God knows everything that's going to happen in your life, then your future seems fixed. And it's not really up to you. You're not really an agent. However, in the modern period, beginning roughly around the 15th century, with the rise of modern science, Descartes, Bacon, etc., there's the presupposition that nature acts according to fixed laws. And these laws determine what's going to happen. Just thinking about it in terms of billiard balls on a pool table, right? In fact, I think Kant even uses, as several philosophers use this example.
Yeah, Newton too. I mean, that's
thank you. Yeah.
I mean, billiard balls is the great example of the Enlightenment.
It's the classic example, right? Because knowing the properties of the billiard balls, knowing their location, their mass, etc., if I know the velocity of where the one billiard ball is hitting the other billiard ball, given the laws of nature about things like friction and inertia, etc., I should be able to predict with almost 100% certainty that that billiard ball is going to go in that pocket. And even if I can't predict it with 100% certainty, the idea is that some perfect scientist, knowing the laws of nature, knowing every iota of every fact, could make those predictions.
And that's determinism in the scientific sense.
Exactly.
If you know all your inputs, you'll know all of your outputs.
That's right. As long as you also know the laws governing the inputs. So we can think about the inputs as the state of affairs prior to whatever activity we want to understand, right? So again, given the location of the billiard balls, given their mass, given their location, etc., given these laws of nature, a certain amount of force will result in an event that one seemingly, again, can predict with 100%. That's, the fundamentals really of modern science, is the idea that we can know with some degree of certainty what's going to happen. So if we're going to shoot a satellite out past our solar system, the only reason we can know with some degree of confidence that it's going to end up, somewhere out into outer space, given the mass of various planets, given the laws of gravity, right? None of those are changing. They seem to be fixed and eternal. Here we get the modern problem of free will. If the laws of nature are fixed and unchanging, given the fact that there is some fixed state of affairs prior to any action that I make, you can pick any time slice prior to my action. You could pick 1 second before the sperm and the egg fertilized and I was conceived. You could go back to 1 nanosecond after the Big Bang. Doesn't matter. Given any time slice at any time, plus the laws of nature, everything that happens is therefore fixed. And that's universal, happens everywhere, causal determinism.
And thus any point in time could be T0. And you could evolve from T0 to T1 to T2 to T3 deterministically forever and ever.
That's right.
And this is already kind of in the loop, even the Enlightenment, like one of my favorite novels, Dennis Diderot's Jacques the Fatalist, where the whole thing is this servant talking to his master, and the master's miserable about life. And the servant's like, why do you care? It's great. Everything's determined.
Everything that we have going on in this room is predicated on the notion that there are laws of nature governing how the molecules in this table are fixed, the spectra of light that's being used, the cameras, right? All of this stuff that we rely on is predicated on the capability of modern science to make these things based on predictions, given elements, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's very, very hard to resist the idea that universal causal determinism holds, right? Every time we go to a pharmacy and get some kind of medication, we're getting it because, given the fact that I have a bacterial infection or something like that, given such and so antibiotics, we can say with a high degree of probability this is going to take care of things. It's not random, right? That would truly be problematic, right? That would be taking a step into Salvador Dali world, right? Where you put your hand into the bottle and it turns to goo. But no, I can pick up the bottle and put it down. All right, so again, the modern problem then is, given this understanding of the universe, which is the one that is the dominant of the day, that of modern science, seemingly we could predict everything that's going to happen in your life. And if that's true, then where are you as the agent? Now, my take on this problem, however, is that it's not really about determinism, right? So almost always whenever this problem is proposed, people will talk about it as if determinism specifically is the problem. This is a little bit subtle, but think about the idea of the laws of nature being merely probabilistic. If the laws of nature are probabilistic, I mean, I say merely, but if they're probabilistic...
Well, for example, if it's a frequentist view of the universe where the absolute function is the most frequent probabilistically, so you have distributions of probability, you still have the same problem.
Exactly. So, I mean, given any input, there's a 50% chance it's going to do this, there's a 50% chance it's going to do that. It's fixed, right? But at the time, you can't predict, right? So those are indeterministic laws. It still seems like the problem still results in what does my agency consist, right? It seems just as problematic as determinism, right? Probabilistic laws also are still governing everything that happens. It's just merely in terms of percentages. And in fact, that really is how we think about laws of nature these days, particularly in the quantum realm.
Yeah, also because they're reversible. Both classical and quantum rules show reversibility, which also further locks in an agency.
Which is where things also get really crazy. The idea that, you can run the whole universe in reverse. And that actually is helpful because it then speaks to what I think the problem really is. Because if you could have indeterministic laws, again, indeterministic laws, and they're going to result in the same kind of problem of agency as the deterministic ones, now we have to ask ourselves, well, what really is the issue? And my take on it is what, as you alluded to at the beginning, is what I call the problem of the disappearing agent. So for any event that occurs, right, if I'm moving this bottle across the table, right, that's an event, right? That's an event that occurs in the world. It's the result of my hand, pushing against it and moving it. And then that movement is presumably the result of a muscular contraction in my arm, which is the result of some neuron firing in my spine, which is in turn the event caused by some activity in my brain. So it seems like for any given event that occurs that is the result of what we would like to think of as an agent, there's an event causal flow that precedes that event in which, where is the agent? Where is the person who's really in charge? Because again, each step of the way seems to just be an effect of some cause. And in that sense, the agent just disappears into the causal flow.
This really was a big deal, particularly in early quantum physics, and for Niels Bohr particularly. Because for Niels Bohr, he absolutely insisted that indeterminacy and that the Copenhagen interpretation were essential to there being free will whatsoever. And from your perspective, and not only from yours, this is something I've heard before, he was wrong.
Right.
And not only that, but the reason why he was so insistent about Copenhagen, like to the point in time that he drove. I mean, he maligned De Broglie. I mean, he drove Schrödinger crazy. Was because of this particular issue. He felt that the wave function collapsed. Copenhagen interpretation was essential for there to be free will. But from your perspective, that's not the case.
No, that's not. I mean, mere indeterminism doesn't help anything, right? As one philosopher put it, it takes what was something that was a predictable action into just the kind of jerking, jumping results of a puppet. Because again, every event that's happening now is just some event occurring as the result of some probabilistic law. Now, so you go from something that at least was deterministic, where you could predict it, to now something you can't even predict. And imagine how we're trying to go through the world, right, interacting with one another, where we can't really have the sorts of assurances that we normally have. So indeterminism alone doesn't solve the problem. Now, there are those who have tried to take the route similar, saying first we've got to open the door with indeterminism, and then something else comes in, right? And we're just going to leave that one aside for today.
And doesn't that usually end up in kind of like a rotisserie chicken version of freedom, they call it?
Well, that was Kant, right?
Yeah.
Actually, we're going to come to that in just a minute. So we're going to hold on to our rotisserie chicken, or we're going to let our rotisserie chicken. But actually, in a way, that's also helpful, because we would draw the distinction between actions that are under our control versus ones that are spasms.
Yeah.
Right? Ones which are jerks, right? In the case of someone who has Tourette's, that's exactly what we think is going on. Their agency is impaired, right? As a result of some sort of dysfunction with the brain, right? Now,
well, what about when there's not a dysfunction with the brain, like an
well, presumably then that's where we start saying, okay, now in some sense, this is under the control of the agent. And that's exactly the sort of distinction that we seemingly want to make.
Certainly legally.
Oh, morally?
Yeah.
I mean, it cuts across the whole spectrum, right? I mean, one way of motivating this, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, think about denying agency, right? So when I give an exam, I'm just going to go ahead and put grades on it and then arbitrarily distribute the exams to everybody in the class. Because, right, agency is an illusion. It doesn't really matter, whether you get your paper back, because you're not really in control of the actions anyway.
Well, in the modern discourse, denying someone's agency is equivalent to denying their humanity.
Precisely. So another way of parsing this is calling it naturalism. Naturalism being, again, the presupposition that the same sort of mode of explanation we use for the natural world is also universal. That it's also the right mode of explanation for human beings. Now, most of us these days who are at least to some degree enlightened do think that humans are just very sophisticated animals. But we think that sophistication precisely consists in some sort of ability to be in control of our actions and make choices in a way that, say, lower animals don't. So, usually the example I'll use to motivate this in class, if you're out camping and a bear comes in and mauls your campsite and steals your food, it would seemingly be inappropriate to try and blame the bear for doing this, right? You wouldn't, shame on you, bear, right? Bad bear. No, right? I mean, you just think that the animal is behaving as it, naturally does, as a function of its instincts and its, the smell of the food. On the other hand, John, if you break into my campsite and mess everything up and steal my picnic basket, I'm going to say, hey man, what the hell are you doing? Why did you do this?
But when you have a dog,
right,
you're on the hairy edge.
Right, you are. Hairy, I like that. So, what are the three traditional responses to this problem? The first one, actually I'll name them and then go back. So there's hard determinism, soft determinism, and libertarianism. Hard determinism is very similar to the position you mentioned earlier, which is, yep, universal causal determinism obtains. It is the case that every event is causally determined by its previous event, the way I would frame it, and what I call event causal explanation. So the real bugbear is event causal explanation, the ability to, again, explain any event as a function of some prior event. So the hard determinist, popularized by a fellow by the name of Baron von Holbach, French-German philosopher in the 18th century.
Yelling, right?
Huh?
It's like in the whole post-Hegelian thing, yeah.
Oh, actually, it's pre-Hegelian. It's right in there, though, with the rise of the sort of social project based on using a sort of scientific form, right, for understanding society.
So it's like right after Kant that you're talking.
Kant?
So it's like right after Kant.
Yeah, it's not long after Kant. That's right. Now, Holbach, then, again, hard determinist, he bites the bullet, right? He says, yes, event causal explanation is the right way to explain everything, including human action, because guess what? Free will is an illusion. right? There really is no fundamental difference between your behavior and the bear's behavior, right? They both are just one event following another event in the natural world. Now, as I gestured, Holbach actually, and other hard determinists, there are contemporary hard determinists.
B.F. Skinner.
Skinner would fall into that camp, that's right. They think that this is actually a boon because now, for example, you don't blame a person for suffering from depression, right? Where in former centuries, if you go back far enough, we would say, well, there are demons, right? Causing these problems. We're going to drill holes in the guy's head, and the demons will be released, and now he'll be able to be, a healthy person. Mm-hmm. Go a little bit further down the line, though, and you've got sloth, right? Which is, of course, a deadly sin. So you blame the person, again, for the sort of behaviors that we would now recognize as, robust clinical depression. So medicine, right, is so much better off. Psychology, according to the hard determinist, so much better off. Sociology, so this is really the beginning of sociology as well. We can now try to diagnose social problems in terms of the causal factors that go into the sorts of things that we care about, like poverty or how to, create the most ideal city, as opposed to, again, this sort of notion of blaming everybody for what they're doing. And this is not, can be a powerful idea when we think about things like, say, a kid coming from Compton, right? He grows up in a certain environment in which he's only exposed to certain ways of life. He has no models other than those that he sees around him. He has no father figures. There's no notion that there's something higher to aspire to. So in that sort of environment, right, here's your Skinnerian, right, the environment, it's highly predictable, right, that 99% of those young black men are never going to make it out of the ghetto, and a certain percentage of them, in fact, are going to end up having some sort of gang-related experience and will die. So now, how do we address that problem? Hold on, let me finish this. Right? Are we going to say the issue really is the result of those individuals making bad choices, or are we going to say no? This is really a social problem that we've allowed ghettos to exist. We fix the ghettos, we'll fix the behavior, and things will be better. That's what the hard determinist thinks is, a good thing that would come from adopting this view. What were you going to ask?
So then how do you end up with like Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, or James Baldwin, Albert Camus? Like, how do you end up with those figures from that perspective?
I take it you mean geniuses?
No.
Okay.
Because I don't think any of those people at that moment in time would have called themselves a genius. Typically, the people who call themselves geniuses were of much higher social class, like Jean-Paul Sartre. The people who usually battle their way out of, out of extreme poverty by clawing their way through a public library.
Okay.
They don't think of themselves as a genius.
Okay.
They think of themselves as just doing the hard work.
Right. So we're thinking about the exception, right? We're thinking about the person
by definition.
Right. Yeah, by definition. That's right. Well, on the one hand, there's a kind of romantic version of that, which is to say, if one just really applies oneself hard enough and one has the sorts of inherent virtues that the person has, then they will nevertheless effloresce no matter what circumstances they're born into.
Calvinism.
Let's keep Calvin out of it just for a minute.
Well, yeah,
we got a lot of guys on the table here.
Yeah,
and
but something like that.
Microphone.
At the end of the day, like just as you're predetermined to fail, you're predetermined to succeed.
Ultimately, yes. But again, you're correct that we also need an explanation for the anomalies, right? Like your James Baldwin, like your Jung, or et cetera, right? So that we not only are explaining the vast number of lifestyles that come from a certain condition, but also what was it in that individual's background that resulted in that. And in large cases, let's go back to my ghetto example, the kids who don't seem to fall into those problems notoriously have had at least one person in their life who genuinely cared about them and actually mentored them or loved them, right? The really bad cases are where there's no father, the mother's, maybe an addict, or she's just not around because she's constantly having to try and work to keep the, house running. And what are the other models? Well, it's gang members, pimps, and drug dealers, right?
So, like in the case of Malcolm X, his revelation in prison through his mentorship through the Nation of Islam.
That's right. And Malcolm, in his autobiography, right, says basically, if I hadn't had that, I would have been dead, right? And he also says things like, if society were different, for example, the guy who he ran numbers for, could have been a great doctor, could have been an astrophysicist.
Yeah, absolutely.
If he'd just been born into different circumstances. Okay, so these are all lovely examples of ways in which we already kind of presuppose hard determinism. But, as I said, it's pretty tough to swallow that one all the way down. Again, nobody in any class is going to say, sure, just distribute the papers, and the grades don't really affect anything because whatever grade you earned wasn't up to you anyway, right? You didn't really earn it or not earn it, so there's really no idea of, giving one sort of praise and the other one blame. Relatedly, in terms of our traditional ways of thinking about moral judgment, you have to lose any sort of thick notion of blame, right? So where someone, say, has lived a life where they have had true desires in causing wicked actions, right? They genuinely have embraced voluntarily to do terrible things. We typically would want to say of someone that is a horrible person, right? I mean, that's not just, bad manners, right? That person is evil, right?
Well, I mean, Hillary Clinton once said, I find it there being no problem saying Nazis are bad people.
Precise, or evil, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
evil,
we want to say Eichmann, evil.
Yeah. It's not really. It doesn't take a great deal of.
Right.
I don't need ontology for that.
No, exactly, and we don't think that, right? Okay, well, Eichmann was just a product, and just a product of his environment, and therefore, we should just let him, go be an accountant now. No, right?
It falls quite flat, in fact. Yeah.
So we hold these individuals deeply morally responsible. And again, most of us do this in daily life, right? If you step on my foot accidentally, I go, oh, no problem. On the other hand, if you just, come over and start stomping on my foot, what the fuck are you doing, John, right? Stop that. Again, I'm sorry if I'm swearing when I'm not supposed to be swearing. So that's the hard determinist position. Again, it is a minority view. There are some who like it. But as we see, there are some deep problems with it. It just does not comport at all with our common sense intuition that, at least to some degree, sometimes it's up to us what we do. Okay, so next position, soft determinism. Also known as compatibilism. Unfortunately, I have to introduce both titles here to make full sense of it. So the soft determinist is a determinist insofar as he embraces universal causal determinism, like the hard determinist. He doesn't deny the universality of causal determinism, or, in my language, event causal explanation. However, he still thinks that there's some relevant sense in which we are genuinely free. David Hume would be the famous figure, the Scottish empiricist, for this view. And his answer is, look, freedom just is choosing in accordance with your wants. And that's compatible with there being universal event causal explanation. How so? Well, think about going to the cheesecake factory. All right. You like cheesecakes, John? You like cheesecake?
Sure.
All right, play along whether you like cheesecake.
Cheesecake.
All right, so there you are standing before the case of all the delicious-looking cheesecakes. All right, you got your chocolate cheesecake, you got your New York cheesecake, you got your red velvet. What kind of cheesecake do you like, John?
Red velvet.
Red velvet. John likes the red velvet. So what do? You choose the red velvet, and you have the red velvet. Free will. You chose in accordance with your wants. Now think about this. Imagine you go up to the counter and you have no desires whatsoever. No wants whatsoever. Make a choice.
That'd be absurd.
Exactly. Right? It's just kind of like, that one.
Well, it's interesting because it was as a response to Hume at the Sod, put forward his idea of freedom, and that he was only free for you to do the things which absolutely repulse you. Mm. That the only way to be free was to actually even deny and eviscerate your desires and wants.
And
which is on that same...
And Hume thinks that that's, as you just said, absurd.
Yeah.
Right? Trying to make this is the compatibilists' bread and butter. What do we really mean when we say freedom? What does it really mean? Well, the idea, according to the compatibilist, is we have desires in the background. If we didn't have desires in the background, there can be no choice. that choice is exactly the product of having some desire in the background, and that there's a difference between a desire just kind of impelling you towards an action versus you saying, no, this is what I want, therefore I choose it, free will. Compatibilism is subtle, and there are very, very deep and sophisticated contemporary versions of it we don't have time to get into more fully. So I'm just going to talk about what is the standard criticism of soft determinism a la Hume. Determinism a la Hume. Least favorite cheesecake at the Cheesecake Factory. the least popular, at least among the Scots. All right, so the Scots like it. So think about it this way. Imagine that you're an alcoholic. So you go to the liquor store, and there's the whiskey, vodka, gin. You want the gin, you choose the gin, you bring it up to the counter, you buy it. Seemingly Hume has to say, yeah, that's free will. You chose in accordance with your wants. The alcoholic wanted the gin, he chose the gin, therefore free will. But we would want to draw the distinction precisely between the behavior of an addict versus that of a person with free will or a free agent. So this is a big problem for the early compatibilists, that basically you have this devastating counterexample, right, that derives from the very premises of the theory. So that's one of the major then problems with compatibilism, right? It seems to be compatible with too much. It's also compatible with the behavior of an addict that nobody would want to call free agency. So what's left? Well, the last position is that of the libertarian. And we have to immediately point out that by libertarian, we're not talking about the political sense of libertarian, but this distinctive metaphysical position on free will. And, fancy word metaphysical, right? All we mean is reality at its deepest level. Now, the libertarian in some ways will not be very foreign to one's mind, because it's actually very much the sort of traditional picture of religion, right? According to libertarianism, there's the denial of universal causal determinism. No, you can't predict every event that's going to occur. Why? Because people have free will in this very robust way. What robust way is that? Well, when they choose, the choice is totally up to them, and nothing is sufficient to determine their choice other than the person. This has been the position of famous 20th century philosophers like Roderick Chisholm and Richard Taylor, where seemingly we have to recognize that there's more than one causal form